Good evening, everybody. My name is John Kampfner. It's a great pleasure to have you all here tonight and to have our distinguished panel. The emergency debate hosted by Intelligence Squared tonight, Georgia and Ukraine should be allowed to join NATO. I assume that everybody has done their initial votes. Second speaker, Robert Skidelsky. Lord Skidelsky, among many other things, is author of The World After Communism, a long-time watcher of Russian affairs and chairman of the Center for Global Studies and professor of political economy at Warwick. Robert.
My reason for opposing NATO expansion was very clearly stated by an American strategist, Kent Mayer, in the year 2000. That's when the idea was to let in the Baltic states. He said any such move would create an irreconcilably suspicious and hostile atmosphere between Russia and the West, and that could result in a return of the Cold War. I'm doing something wrong. Okay, I'm shorter than Mr. Ribachuk. It would lead to an irreconcilable and hostile atmosphere and would result in a new Cold War. They were allowed in the Baltic states, and so it has turned out. Today we are on the brink of a new Cold War, and I want us to step back from that brink. And the best way to step back from it would be to put the question of Ukraine's and Georgia's membership on hold for the time being. In fact, Mr. Ribachuk suggested that that would be a sort of a long drawn-out process, and I think the longer drawn out it is, the better. But I'll come back to that. Now, it's nonsense to say, as David Miliband did in Kiev, that Ukraine and Georgia must be let into NATO because they want to. Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty says clearly that countries are invited to join NATO. And it has to be that way round because it's not an empty gesture. NATO is a military alliance, and you take on military commitments to people who join it. And it's not just that they may feel more secure, you may at some point have to go to war to defend them. And therefore, people have to be invited in on the ground of whether it is in the interests of the members to take on those particular commitments. And I understand very well the feelings of countries who do feel threatened, but we have to ask also, are we prepared ultimately to go to war to protect the situation that exists in those areas? Now, one of the strongest reasons for not having Ukraine and Georgia in NATO is that they have unsettled borders. David Miliband has talked about the need to defend the integrity of frontiers. But the frontiers of Ukraine and Georgia are far from stable. They were newly created states which came into existence when the Soviet Union broke up. Eastern Ukraine is 40% Russia, and 1.2 million of the 2 million people in Crimea are Russian. Georgia's northern border bisects the two halves of Ossetia. These are the classic settings for separatist movements. We've just seen what this means in Georgia. This isn't a debate about the rights and wrongs of the recent war, for which both sides have to bear some responsibility. Technically, Russia was the aggressor because it invaded another country, whereas Georgia was simply trying to establish its control over one of its provinces. But in doing so, Georgia broke 15 years of precarious live and let live between Georgians and non-Georgians. So there was a precarious status quo, and President Saakashvili deliberately upset it. And that is the sort of situation to which NATO could easily be sucked. And the important point to remember here is that Georgia would come into NATO with a claim on South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which, given all we know about the temperament of President Saakashvili would carry the risk, I won't say it's more than a risk, of sucking NATO and Britain into a war with Russia. Is that in our interest? Do we want to be faced with that situation? Now, the majority of Georgians seem to be in favor of their country joining NATO, but that's not true of the Ukraine. Ukraine, too, though, has been promised NATO membership, even though its leaders are deeply divided over it. In fact, the leader of the pro-NATO faction, President Yushchenko, is about to become much less significant in Ukrainian politics, I believe, and the other two leaders are not in favor of Ukraine joining NATO. And what's more, any attempt to bring the Ukraine into NATO would almost certainly lead to its breakup, with the eastern part and the Crimea coping for independence or union with Russia. Of course, Russia would foment it, but that, of course, that's part of this particular game. Do we want to be sucked into that? A huge potential for military conflict. Let me be clear about this. If these countries come into NATO, we would face not just a new Cold War, but a series of hot wars, small hot wars, all over the Caucasus and possibly in Central Asia. We would be committing to guaranteeing the frontiers of some of the most unstable countries in the world. And what's it all for? What are our strategic interests? Well, we talk of spreading our values of freedom and democracy. What we would actually be encouraging is wave after wave of suicidal nationalism to express itself. Is that the best way to encourage the growth of freedom and democracy in the Ukraine and Georgia, not to mention in Russia itself? Now let me come finally to the most difficult part of my case. I believe that all our mistakes in this area, the root of our mistakes, lies in President Clinton's assertion in 1992 that it was the right of all qualified democracies to join NATO, and I quote, regardless of history and geography. But the one thing you can't avoid thinking about in foreign policy is history and geography. That determines so much. Georgia and Ukraine might well wish they were somewhere else. But the fact is that they are where they are, small countries on the edge of a large and powerful country. All sovereign states, of course, are equal, but it is wise for a small state, geographically situated on the edge of a much larger one, to ensure that its foreign policy is not seen as posing any threat to its larger neighbour. And President Saakashvili notably failed to pass that test. He has converted his state into a puppet of America and has assaulted the Ossetian community within Georgia's borders. Now, which country does pass that test? Well, let me give you an example. Finland passed that test very, very well. Although part of is it 1 minute? Part of historic Russian Empire, it retained its independence right through the Soviet period. And another country nearer home that's passed that test is Ireland. Now, let me end by saying I don't ignore the threat of Russian expansion. Historically, it's been an expansionist power, and it has resented its loss of empire. I take seriously the argument that it will do everything it can to grab it back in one form or another, if it's allowed to. But to my mind, the best way of satisfying Russia's sense of greatness while curbing its freedom to act unilaterally is to embed it in a wider security system. It's a little-known fact that Russia wanted to join NATO in 2002, but was turned down. I regard that as one of the great missed opportunities of the post-Cold War era. It may still be open to bring Russia into NATO together with Ukraine and Georgia, that I would support that proposition wholeheartedly. As it is, I have to oppose the motion before us.